At first just ghostly, turn the wider shade of pale.
Watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
It's really cold out, and right on cue, Twitter has been overrun with climate deniers cracking tired jokes about global warming. But beyond social media jabs lies a serious and ongoing discussion about how scientists connect extreme weather, be it a cold snap, a hurricane, or California's extreme fire season, to underlying climate change. Because the truth is, this science is really new. The first proper climate attribution study was published in 2004. Before that, scientists had struggled to explain exactly how specific weather events were connected to climate change. Now, more and more solid, peer-reviewed studies show how climate change affects the likelihood and severity of extreme weather. And the studies are getting published really quickly after extreme weather events take place. Remember that study from 2004? It looked at a European heat wave that took place in 2003 and took a year and a half to complete. In contrast, just 3 months after Hurricane Harvey, scientists at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a study showing that Harvey dropped 38% more rain than it would have without underlying climate change. Another group, called World Weather Attribution, found that hurricanes that size have become 3 times more probable. Here's how Miles Allen, one of the authors of the first climate attribution study, explained why studies today are getting published so much faster.
When we performed the study in 2003 looking at the European heat wave, nobody had actually attempted to quantify the role of human influence on climate in a specific weather event. We are now looking at accelerating that whole process, because once you've agreed on the method you're using, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The actual time it takes to actually do the calculations is not that long.
The developing science of attribution means scientists will have to completely reevaluate how they talk about extreme weather. Because terms like 500-year floods and 100-year droughts, terms that are supposed to indicate the frequency of a hazardous event, are becoming less and less helpful as frequencies keep changing. And it also means that in a few months, scientists should be able to explain the relationship between this cold snap and climate change. And projecting further into the future, it's entirely possible that we will soon hear scientists make these links as these events are happening.
We should be able to do this much faster, but in my view, in the long term, this should be part of the duties of the Weather Service. It's no longer enough for the Weather Service just to predict the weather. They should be in the business of explaining it as well.
Talk to me about what can be done, unfortunately, we have to address the notion of these climate change deniers out there, but they surely would love this. Yeah, don't worry about climate change, booze lackeys on it.
Well, it's not such a crazy idea after all, because there are natural episodes in the climate system, within the Earth system, that have demonstrated this is possible. For example, in 1991, Mount Pinatubo, a volcano in the Philippines, injected something on the order of 17 megatons of sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. And these small particles, they actually filter the solar radiation from reaching the Earth, and it actually cooled the global temperature of the planet by about 0.6 degrees Celsius over a span of 12 to 15 months. So this one aspect of geoengineering is to do this deliberately if we are serious about trying to maintain our global warming beneath an overall threshold of 2 degrees warming.
So how are you going to ignite a volcano?
So it's a great question. It would be done artificially by a series of rocket launches, airplane deployments at different latitudes, at different frequencies, in order to decrease the incoming shortwave radiation. That's one technique. Another technique would be to fertilize the ocean with iron to cause massive blooms of phytoplankton or algae to draw down, take carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester into the ocean. So theoretically, it's possible, but there are huge ethical and governance issues about this sort of deliberate manipulation of the Earth's climate.
Give me an ethical issue.
Well, what happens, for example, if a rogue nation unilaterally decides to do geoengineering and changes the climate for that one country's best interest? And then what are the downstream unintended consequences of global engineering? How would it change global precipitation patterns and changes of droughts and floods downstream from this one rogue nation, there's a lot of this area where we don't know what we don't know.
Florida, where they're in for a messy holiday, sad to say. A state of emergency has been declared there because of a green, slimy, smelly, and flat-out dangerous invasion. Green algae spreading in the water and ruining many people's July 4th plans. ABC's Eva Pilgrim is in Jensen Beach looking into how long this thing is going to last. Eva, good morning to you.
And Dan, it's not looking any better this morning. The algae has actually grown. It's spread further out into the water, and that awful smell we keep talking about has also spread. If you spend any amount of time near this algae, you'll probably need one of these. We saw a lot of people with these yesterday. This algae giving people headaches and even making it hard to breathe.
Exactly.
Okay, so what do we do?
So the other thing is horrifying. It is that you could actually spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up in a kind of ugly tech fix.
You could spray something into the atmosphere to change. Okay,
spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
So in the end, pollution saved them all. We owe pollution. We owe acid rain an apology, is what you're saying.
It would be a totally imperfect technical fix.
Okay.
It would have risks. It wouldn't get us out of the long-run need to stop polluting, but it might actually save people and be useful.
Okay, so how, again, I interrupted slightly there. How does it work? How many planes are we talking about here? How do you do this?
So let's say you wanted to stop it warming in 2020. You'd start with a fleet of just 2 or 3 kind of modified business jets.
What kind of like a G6?
Yeah, like a G650.
Like a G6.
That's
like
it.
A G6.
And you'd put say 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year, and each year you have to put a little more. And this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in.
No, we'll get to it eventually. Yeah.
But it does.
But in the meantime, we're shrouding the earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid.
You're
bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass? Blanketing the earth in sulfuric acid, because I'm all for it. This is the all-chocolate dinner. I still get to have my CO2, and I just need to spray sulfuric acid.
Right.
All over the earth.
Right question. But we put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, and that's
so
good or bad?
It's terrible.
But it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that, a tiny fraction of that. So we should reduce that sulfuric acid.
So if it kills 1 million people and we're only
bad.
doing 1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
Okay.
But that's so killing people is not the objective here.
Killing people, not the objective. I just wanted to be clear. I just wanted to be clear. All right. Could an individual start this?
In practice, only a country.
Okay. What about a man in like a hollowed out volcano with henchmen who occasionally shakes his fist at the sky and says, "They said I was a fool at Harvard. Who's the fool now?"
It's the natural worry. I won't
shake your fist and say the fools.
It's the natural worry, but I think in the end, no. This would be done by major countries, but the problem is how countries agree about where to set the thermostat, who decides, and my biggest reason for writing the book and for talking about it is my view that we won't make good decisions in ignorance.
So we have to have the discussion now so that when it becomes our last hope, people can say, "Hey, we talked about this. Remember, we said we get to do it."
The worst way to make decisions about this would be if we all agree that we won't talk about it in polite society, we suppress it, which is basically what had been happening, and then in 2030, suddenly in a crisis, we make fast decisions.
Maybe it's happening already. You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now, and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
It seems extremely unlikely.
That the United States is not telling something to its citizens? That seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already. Dr. Mister, thank you so much. David Keith, A Case for Climate Engineering. We'll be right back.
will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
Includes thousands of pounds of a chemical compound. By 1962, however, Dr. Wexler was singing a different tune on weather modification. His new calculations worried him that rocket fuels, of the type the world's militaries had been firing off into the atmosphere in all manner of experiments, weather and otherwise, since the end of World War II, was possibly permanently affecting the climate and irreparably changing the world's weather for the worse. Throughout 1962, he delivered a speech titled On the Possibilities of Climate Control to at least 3 different groups across the country on how the residues of rocket fuels, including chlorine and bromine compounds, were contaminating the upper atmosphere not just by destroying the ozone layer, but by punching holes in the ionosphere. James Fleming of Colby College points out that Wexler was concerned not just about industrial pollution of the lower atmosphere, but that planetary-scale manipulation of the Earth's shortwave and long-wave radiation budget would result in, quote, rather large-scale effects on general circulation patterns in short or longer periods, even approaching that of climate change, end quote. In other words, Wexler was saying that these rocket fuel compound residues were causing what could eventually be permanent climate change. And by the way, as Fleming points out, our modern history of ozone depletion only really dates back to the 70s. That's when they started talking about that as being an issue and a problem that we were facing. It's also a good time to point out that by 1962, when Wexler was saying this, the U.S. military, USSR, and others had been not only detonating rockets in the atmosphere for various science and military experiments, including hundreds of sounding rockets from Antarctica, but they were also reportedly blowing up nuclear warheads in the upper atmosphere, including top-secret high-altitude nuclear testing operations Hardtack and Argus in 1958, and Operation Fishbowl, which had just begun in 1962 when Wexler began making these claims. Wexler noted that the effects could be temporary, but he also said these compounds could be left behind as a catalyst that could cause permanent climate and weather changes. He warned of, quote, a growing anxiety that, quote, man, in applying his growing energies and facilities against the power of the winds and storms, may do so with more enthusiasm than knowledge, and so cause more harm than good. There had also been some suggestion that the world's militaries could use this kind of knowledge to wage geophysical warfare by purposefully attacking the ozone layer over an enemy country. Wexler spent 1962 warning against man's attempt to control the climate and the weather, and that rocket fuels could be doing irreversible damage to the planet's climate. This was a man who was sitting on every relevant scientific advisory board on weather and weather research that the U.S. had at the time. He was working alongside the likes of John von Neumann, and he'd been writing papers on weather control for JFK. So he knew what he was talking about, or at least he should have, and now he was publicly warning against one of the U.S. military's biggest stated goals and biggest justifications for the scientific takeover of Antarctica, where the majority of rocket launches and weather experimentation was taking place at that time. Wexler obviously told the DoD all about his concerns because he was quoted in the Daily Press in February 1962 as saying, "The most heartening thing is that the Department of Defense has ordered an investigation of the possible side effects. These fuels are so new that no one knows much about their effect." Sadly, though, that speech on the possibilities of climate control that he gave in 1962, warning about the potentially permanent negative effects of detonating all these rockets and bombs off in the Earth's atmosphere, and what that was doing to the world's weather and climate, would be the last speech that Harry Wexler would ever give. In August 1962, Dr. Harry Wexler suffered a heart attack at the age of 51 while on vacation in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and died at a Boston hospital a week later. That speech would have normally been published, but due to his untimely death, it never was. A 1962 publication titled Antarctic Research, which includes papers presented to the 10th Pacific Science Congress and bears Wexler's name as editor, was published posthumously in 1962 and features a memorial about him, but makes no mention of his startling findings earlier that year. Even more curious, the first international symposium on rocket and satellite meteorology was held in April of 1962 when he was still alive, and was organized in part by him. Surely he had mentioned his findings there at that symposium, except nothing about his speech or his comments on this matter is mentioned in the final publication of the symposium, which also bears a memorial to Wexler. Eerily, a Rand Corporation man paraphrases Wexler's remarks on opening the symposium regarding man's endeavor to push higher into the atmosphere with his instruments. It's unbelievable that Wexler would not have mentioned the fact that he discovered those very instruments could be permanently screwing up the Earth's climate at that symposium. Weather modification experiments continued unabated, as did rocket and bomb tests. The year after Wexler died and the day after JFK was assassinated, it quietly came out after multiple government denials that a nuclear weapon had been fired in supposedly peaceful Antarctica for reasons the public was never told. The National Academy of Sciences that same year appointed a panel on weather and climate modification to, quote, undertake a deliberate and thoughtful review of the present status and activities in this field and its potential and limitations for the future. The following year, 1964, the director of National Science Foundation announced the appointment of a special commission on weather modification, and by 1966, NASA Administrator Homer Newell completed a report to the Interdepartmental Committee for Atmospheric Sciences titled A Recommended National Program in Weather Modification, which advocated direct modification of the weather to include lightning suppression efforts, which, if you think about it, just seems like a really bad idea that would disrupt the electrical balance of the atmosphere, and that's just for starters. Even Newell admitted in his own report that their weather modification experiments had shown, quote, changes in species, which led to, quote, considerable uncertainties relative to specific results of weather modification. In other words, all of the stuff that the Club of Rome began blaming on the rest of us in the 1970s, everything from ozone depletion to climate change to negatively impacting the flora and the fauna, can also be traced back to widespread government weather modification experimentation and military rocket and nuclear bomb testing dating back to the 50s and 60s and warned about by Dr. Harry Wexler just before his untimely death in 1962. Today, we see things like this.
Buildings have collapsed. There are reports from New Orleans of people trapped in buildings that have come down around them.
Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, has been hit by a major earthquake.
Earthquake in Japan, a powerful quake.
The tsunami has engulfed several cities.
This is the moment Japan's nuclear disaster began.
Interrupt regular programming to bring you this weather alert.
There is a tornado on the ground in the southern portions of Joplin, just to the south of our station here.
We're told all the time that human beings are the cause for all the environmental woes, and thus we have no other choice than to turn over our trust to the government for global geoengineering experiments to commence. And although we will likely never be told how far weather modification and control experimentation went, or where those experiments are at today, when you see something like this coming up from Antarctica, just realize that they've only been talking about using that still mostly off-limits continent for planetary weather control since the 1950s, and warnings against the possible irreparable damage of widespread weather modification and geoengineering from someone who was there during all of that early experimentation and who went down in history as one of the greatest meteorologists the U.S. has ever had, were ignored.
face at first just ghostly. Turn the wider shade of pale. She said there is no reason, and the truth is plain to see. But I wander through my playing cards, would not let her be one of 16 vestal virgins. We're leaving for the coast, and although my eyes were open, they might just as well have been closed. And so it was later, as the mirror told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly. Turn the